Previously, I tackled Warhawk, which was one of SingleTrac's first game. Still had a decent hit, but was overshadowed. And that was SingleTrac's second game, released the exact same day from Warhawk, and that's game number 23, Twisted Metal. One of Sony's first major party titles that became a hit outside from Japan and would be remembered as Sony's classic IPs. Published by Sony Computer Entertainment and developed by SingleTrac. The story takes place in December 24th, 2005, or Christmas Eve 2005, where a man who has a burnt face due to a freak car crash accident by the name of Calypso, which he hosts a demolition derby / car combat tournament called Twisted Metal, which is the 10th annual running series, meaning it began all the way back in 1995, which I'm pretty sure you could get the hint. Where he gathers 12 competitors via an incoming email that says, "Will you drive?" Which the competitors are Needles Kane, an escaped mental patient and a clown serial killer who must find his lost friend, Harold the Wacky Lunch Sack, who drives an ice cream truck called Sweet Tooth, Charlie Kane, a lonely cab driver from New York who must know what happened to his son who disappeared 20 years ago, who drives a yellow taxi called Yellow Jacket, Mr. Ash, an unknown creature from the underworld who must capture a creature which he rightfully owns called Black, who is with Calypso, who drives a semi-truck called Darkside, Carl Roberts, a good cop from the LAPD who must stop Calypso's deadly tournament and hope that it would be its last, who drives a cop car called Outlaw, Bruce Cochran, a passionate kid from the streets of LA who must get his last chance so he could take his neighborhood out of the war zone, who drives a pink lowrider called Thumper, Agent Stone, an agent who works for an underground freedom organization who must track down an item that could liberate the world, who drives a red sports car called Crimson Fury. Angela Fortin, who is the only female competitor of the tournament, which she is leading a double life and must claim $1 million in cash, who drives a dune buggy called Pit Viper. Commander Mason, a soldier who works for the US government who must find an item, the exact same thing that Agent Stone is trying to find, who drives an HMMWV called Warthog. Mr. Grimm, this version of the Grim Reaper, who has come and collect souls that also include stealing Calypso's soul as well, who drives a motorcycle which is a Ducati Passo. Scott Campbell, a ghost spirit who wants to see his wife and daughter again, as well as making him whole again, due to murder by a clown, who drives a white sports car called Spectre. Dave and Mike, both are high school dropouts from Los Angeles, which then steals a monster truck, which one of them drives a green monster truck called Hammerhead, and Captain Spears, a former commander who is struggling and regretting with his past from the Jungle War in South America and must know how to go back in time and save his men from preventing an enemy trap, who drives a junk car called Roadkill. Once they enter the competition, they must kill each other by using their vehicle of destruction and must duke it out in 6 locations, which all of them takes place in California, Los Angeles, where the tournament is being held. If a driver, which is you, survived and destroyed all of the competitors in the tournament, then you face last year's champion, Minion, a driver who was unknown at the time until it was revealed to be a demon from hell in the next game, which he drives a heavily armored tank called the XJ-39, also known as the Mind Tank, and have to take down the vehicle so you could win the tournament and grant one wish from Calypso himself. Can you destroy the opponents and win the competition? Now, in my previous video, I talked about the company's debut and talked a little bit about Mike Guillaume and his game Warhawk. But now, we're going to talk about David Jaffe and his game Twisted Metal. And this time, there's a lot of things to say about the game. So, here we go. Its development history begins with Jaffe wanted to become a filmmaker, but he couldn't, due that he needed to get a degree and was a very risky move back in the day. While trying to be noticed by Hollywood so he could be a filmmaker, he needed money for his rent. so he became a playtester for Sony ImageSoft in order to pay his rent. This eventually realized him at the time that he was interested in making video games instead of filmmaking, due that games could have unique stories, world building, and some creativity. His first game that he was ever a part of as a designer was Mania, which was a decent hit for Sony at the time. This would be the beginning of that because by that time, Sony would release the PlayStation in Japan in 1994 and now being slated to release internationally in fall 1995. However, to prove that this console would be a hit for Western audiences, Sony was trying to find some Western developers so they could make games exclusively for the system. While that was going on, Jaffe was struggling to get along and had difficulty establishing positive relationships among industry developers due to his hubris. He was almost going to be fired, but was given one more chance by Sony and asked him, along with MickeyMouse, to go to Salt Lake City and find the company Evans and Sutherland, which you all know would be broken up with the company and form their own called SingleTrac. And same as before, they were both immediately impressed of their work, especially when they were in the F-16 virtual cockpit and felt like they were in a 3D virtual world, and both of them agreed that they were the right people to work with. After their trip from Utah, they were heading back to Sony's headquarters in Los Angeles while being stuck in a traffic jam on Interstate 405. They were brainstorming some ideas of what the game would be, using this new 3D tech they had experienced in that trip, until Jaffe had an idea when he jokingly fantasized about using guns and missiles on the other cars and blowing them up, since they were in a traffic jam, and just wanting to just blow up the cars to clear up the traffic. This eventually became the idea that Jaffe knows what he wants to make, and recalled, "We had these amazing visions of this Michael Bay or Michael Mann action movie going down the 405 freeway in LA with car combat out of Mad Max and a potpourri of explosions." Once they made it back to the Sony headquarters and Sony making a deal with SingleTrac, or most of the people working for Evans and Sutherland, since the company wasn't made yet until in 1995, David Jaffe, along with MickeyMouse and other developers, worked on their first two games, with their codenames being Red Mercury, aka Warhawk, and Firestorm, aka Twisted Metal, with a granted of $2 million in advance royalties from Sony, and were given a deadline of less than 12 months. So the development of these two games have to be made very fast, and thus have to be split up into two groups, with Guillaume working on Warhawk, which I already discussed about in my previous video, and Jaffe working on Twisted Metal. Though it wasn't called Twisted Metal back in its development, there were several different title names like Urban Assault, Car and Rockets, High Octane, or Battle Cars, but eventually called it Twisted Metal and they stuck to it ever since. Originally, the first four levels, which are Arena, Warehouse, Freeway, and River Park, were all supposed to be one massive level, and it was like that for the longest time during development. But then they realized that the game would be too short because once that level is done, then you go to the suburban level and then the final level, which is the rooftops level. So in total, the game would have had 3 levels, and that was a huge problem because 1, they couldn't make any more levels due to rush time, 2, they can't add in more opponents with the limited amount of 8 vehicles in that massive level, and 3, the level had several technical issues at the time due that the level was very huge. So Jaffe and his crew decided to split them up into 4 levels, which at the end did paid off since the arena level, being the shortest one out of the entire game, would be easier to let players start out with one opponent and figuring out the controls, and then the number of opponents would increase in the next level. A very smart move for Jaffe and his crew. Another thing that the game added was a multiplayer mode, which Jaffe didn't originally thought of having a multiplayer feature in it, but one programmer took a risk, thinking that it would be a good idea to feature this mode. Jaffe was amazingly impressed of this feature, and thus it was added in the game, and would become a main staple to this series. Though, with the first one, it may have to make a few sacrifices, but we'll get to that in the review later. While many things were added to the game, but however, there were two things that were completely scrapped in the final game. First, they originally had a deal with 7-Eleven, having signed to have their names on billboards in the game, but then backed out because 7-Eleven deemed the game too dark for its time. And second, and it's a big one, they were supposed to have live-action cutscenes in the game, which would have been similar to Warhawk, like the intro of the game, in between cutscenes after finishing a level, and then the boss appearance in the final level. But there was one thing that Warhawk didn't have, and that were the live-action endings, which featured the character you chose. Though it still had some bland dialogue, but at least it's tolerable and watchable compared to Warhawk's cutscenes, which were a complete bore fest. But unfortunately, they were all removed in the final game. Many people thought for the longest time that the reason why the live-action cutscenes were removed is because Jaffe and his crew completely hated them due to being bland and awful, and decided to just remove them altogether and never be heard from again. But that statement is completely debunked, because the real true reason why they were removed, because most of the crew found them too offensive and sexist, and that were the bikini ladies. Yep, it wasn't because of the blood and violence, it was the bikini ladies that deemed it too sexist and told Jaffe to remove them or else. Which is just a shame, because I don't mind seeing these cutscenes in the final game, and heck, Jaffe himself didn't mind them too. But at last, he had no choice, and all of them were removed and never saw the light of day. Until 13 years later, when all of the endings would appear as extra contents in Twisted Metal Head-On Extra Twisted Edition, which was only released in North America for the PS2 in 2008. But the intro, in-between, and boss cutscenes did not appear in the extra content, since Jaffe stated that they were filmed when the game was still not called Twisted Metal yet. And some of them were made when the first 4 levels were still one huge level, and the boss wasn't even called Minion, it was originally called Apocalypse 9, and instead of a demon driver, it was driven by 3 lunatic killers with no names who stole the vehicle and using it for the competition. And unlike the endings, which he was okay of, Jaffe hated the intro, in-between, and boss cutscenes and did not include them in the extra content. Though archival footage did surface from the internet and can be found from a YouTube channel named Demented Derek, which I'll send in the link down in the description below, so you could see it for yourself. So, with the live-action cutscenes removed from the game, what did they do to fix it? Well, since they don't have the time to reshoot everything since it was almost about to be released, they just put in a screenshot of Calypso and put scrolling text for the intro and endings, which again, we'll talk about in the review. So with the game now being finished on time and was set out to release alongside with Warhawk, Jaffe was a bit worried. Why to be exact? Well, due to the fact that the game would not sell well since the people working for SingleTrac and Sony were focusing more at Warhawk and thought it would be a major hit, while Twisted Metal had no focus to both SingleTrac and Sony and wouldn't say anything about it. But not only that, but the playtester were hating the game and said the game plays like shit. But that was mostly Jaffe's fault, due to the fact that he was describing the game as Mortal Kombat with vehicles. and many of its crew presumed this as a fighting game, which was not part of the fighting genre, but part of a vehicular combat genre, which was still new at the time and had never been tackled before. And even when it was first shown alongside with Warhawk at the very first annual E3 1995, Jaffe was still not sure if the game wasn't going to sell well, and almost decided to quit as a video game developer once the game comes out, and would have moved on to another job. But his worries quickly disappeared, because when it was released in North America in November 10, 1995, Europe in January 16, 1996, and Japan in November 15, 1996, it shockingly became a hit, but also a commercial success and received positive reviews from critics. Some, like Game Revolution, praised the game's action and variety of the vehicles, but noted the graphics were a little sloppy. Another reviewer from Next Generation called it another showcase title for the PlayStation, and said while the texture maps are simple, this allows the action to play out fast enough that players will rarely notice the lack of detail, but agreed that the game is too short, contending that even players with normal skills will reach the final stage in about 2 hours, but felt that enduring fun of the 2-player mode nearly makes up for this. And finally, Electronic Gaming Monthly awarded Twisted Metal as the Game of the Year of 1995 and even became number 1 on the list, overpassing other PlayStation titles like Mortal Kombat 3 in number 10, Jumping Flash in number 9, Rayman in number 7, and even SingleTrac's other game, Warhawk, in number 3. But not just that, it also overpassed other games that was non-PlayStation titles, like Gex for the 3DO in number 8, Prehistoric Man for the SNES in number 6, Earthworm Jim Special Edition for the Sega CD in number 5, Samurai Showdown 2 for the Neo Geo AES in number 4, and Chrono Trigger for the SNES in number 2. Safe to say that this game was an astonishing achievement by Jaffe and the crew who worked on the game. But even though it was a hit, the game did have some criticism, like Black Widow from GamePro criticized the graphics and their Stag Arena crowd, difficult to read radar, and heavy breakup, and described the music as weak overall. However, they concluded that despite its flaws, the Twisted game is fun. And another reviewer from Maximum applauded the varying strengths and weakness of the vehicles, and most especially the innovative free-roaming levels. However, they criticized that the game is much too short and concluded a playable game, but one which is probably destined for obscurity, which it didn't, thankfully, because it became one of Sony's first major hits outside from Japan, and by 1996, both Twisted Metal and Warhawk would sell over 500,000 units combined and generated $28 million in revenue for the publisher Sony, and the game alone would sell over 1 million copies in North America alone, and eventually get a Greatest Hits label in 1997, as well as a Windows port, which again, unlike Warhawk, which it never got released, this one did, but was only exclusive to Japan only. And last but not least, the game would appear 22 years later in the 2017 movie Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, which, fun fact, I actually saw this on theaters and was completely shocked that the game would appear in this movie, which to me was mind-blowing to see in the big screen. Now with everything said and done, let's finally head on over to the review and see if the game is still worth playing many years later. So, here we go. The graphics are mostly good, but a bit meh. The style of the game is much more American tone and a bit realistic too, since the game takes place in Los Angeles, like the cities of LA, the freeway of LA, the rooftops of LA, and of course, the suburbia of LA. However, despite the realistic look of the game, that's actually the part that aged poorly. you can really tell that the style, mainly the graphical textures of the buildings and etc., feels dated compared to most recent games that have a much more realistic tone, but that wasn't the case back in 1995, since early 3D games don't visually age well, and for its time, looked cool and neat. So I'll let it slide, as long as the gameplay is great, which we'll get to that shortly. The presentation is alright. The main game HUD shows off stuff like how many opponents there are in the level, what weapons you obtained, your gun temperature if it turns red if it overheats and needs to be recharged, your life bar and how many lives you have, which there are 3 in total, and also the opponent's life bar too. Your map to show where the opponents are, and last but not least, your turbo, which makes you move faster, but once run out, then you have to find the gas to refill your turbo. The next thing I want to talk about is the first person view, which by pressing both start and up buttons, you could see the driver's hands and even move their steering wheel when they steer to the left or steer to the right. And also the inside of the vehicle, which shows a different look from every single driver. Though a bit pixelated, especially when moving the steering wheel, it is a great detail and neat overall. And finally, we have the cutscenes, or should I just say just a picture with scrolling text. But here's the weird part. You don't see the intro text when you start the game or the character you chose. No, you instead have to go to the option menu and select contest history in order to see the intro text, which is just confusing of why they put it in the option menu instead of just putting it once you start the game. But another strange thing is the ending text from each character being compared to the unused live action endings. While some still kept the same, like from the live action scenes, some are completely different, which I'm only going to show one example, because show all of them, then it will take too long. So I'll keep it short, and also consider this a spoiler warning if you don't want to hear it. I'll give you like 5 seconds. Anyways, here you go. The driver of Yellow Jacket, Charlie Kane's text ending, he was trying to find out his son's disappearance over 20 years ago and asked Calypso where he is, only to find out that his lost son turned out to be the killer clown Needles Kane, the driver of Sweet Tooth, which he killed him in battle. This ultimately made Charlie felt shocked, anguished, depressed, and regret, and speeds off to the LA night, which the suffering will never go away of what happened in that contest. But in the live action ending, he wanted to drive again, due that he was getting too old to drive. Though at first Calypso was very angry, thinking that it was a wasteful wish after seeing him drive good in battle, but eventually grants his wish by drinking this potion, which causes him to not age and would live forever. But this also caused Charlie's emotion changed rapidly due to the side effects of the potion, with Calypso saying that he needs a driver to travel the world for new drivers, and asked Charlie if he could do it, which he replied with a different tone,
"Sounds good to me, baby!"
I'm guessing why change most of the characters' bios is because they didn't like most of them and felt underdeveloped, but that's just a theory of mine. Anyways, as for the ending texts, it's pretty lackluster, with 2 background, first with Calypso, then after that the exit where the characters speed their vehicle through the night. Though Outlaw and Roadkill's endings have their own different background, but that's not saying much. Overall, it's fine, but also bland. And also the image of Calypso looking at you is a bit creepy and frightening to my eyes, so I better move on to the next part. The music is awesome and kick-ass. This is the same composers who did Warhawk, but this time it's hard American rock of the 90s, and I absolutely enjoy very much. My favorite music from the game is the Rooftops level, which has American rock and an orchestra blending it very nicely and a blast for my ears. The only gripe I sort of have is the warehouse, river park, and suburban levels. When you start playing in these levels, you hear a music that's a bit soft but dramatic if you're alone in the spot you're on. Until you spot in an opponent, then the song cuts off interruptly and changes to the much harder rock. Though it may be a bit annoying, but it's just a nitpick of mine. And finally, the gameplay. The controls are alright for this game, but unfortunately the standard control is just not cut out for me. Due that they put the circle button as the gas, which for me just doesn't feel right. Luckily, there is an option to change the controls, which there are 3, which are Standard, Deadly Force, and Run and Gun. I chose the Deadly Force control because it just works for me, with the X button for the gas where it should be in the first place. Though other button layouts while on some weird spots, but I got used to it after that. So, as for my experience of the game, I did enjoy playing it at first. I did like how you start with one opponent and then gradually increase the amount of opponents in the next level. And the levels, for the most part, are well designed, with the tracks being smaller at first, then gradually enter tracks that are bigger later on. Though I die many times with getting a game over and have to restart the level over again by entering a password, I still manage to get some enjoyment out of it. Oh, and getting to the main boss of the game, which is Minion, yeah, let's say I had a hard time, until eventually managed to defeat him by pure luck, and a strategy of just getting as much fire, homecoming, and power missiles as possible. However, despite having some enjoyment out of it, playing single player for the second time is just a bit boring and tedious. Though despite switching to another driver, since each driver have their own different stats and a special weapon, but still, it's the exact same feeling. Maybe because since all the endings are just text and nothing else, it just feels empty and unsatisfying once you finish the single player mode. But luckily, there is a saving grace to it all, and that's the multiplayer mode. Just simply plug in a second controller and you'll duke it out with a friend, which does have some fun factor to it, and the most enjoyed if you have a friend with you. However, some levels have to be cut short due to graphical limitation and frame rate issues during its time. While Arena, Warehouse, and Rooftops remain the same like in the single player mode, Freeway, River Park, and Suburban had to be completely shortened out. Examples like the Freeway level, they put in barriers so you could not enter the other parts of the freeway, and also added in civilian vehicles and obstacles for this level. Next is the Suburban level where you can only play in the canal section, which again add in barriers that you can't enter and more obstacles. This time, it's destroyed vehicles and crates, though why they put barriers at some canal parts is beyond me. But many speculate why is because it would be a C-shaped arena, according to the fandom, which is an interesting fact. And finally is the River Park level, and it got the worst treatment out of the 3, which all the buildings from the level are non-existent and is nothing but barriers across all of the borders. To me, it feels like a test level rather than a smaller version of River Park, though the ice hockey arena is still here, so at least that's something resembling River Park, I guess. Anyways, with all I have to say about the game, let's finally head on over to the conclusion and wrap this up. The game is okay, but a great start to the series. The graphics may have looked impressive and great due to its Americanish style back in 1995, but now in present day, it hasn't really aged all that well and looks dated by today's standards. The presentation was good, with the first-person perspective, each showing the inside of the driver's vehicle, was a nice detail, as well as the game HUD too. But all of the character endings, which are text, is just so unsatisfying after being the single-player mode. And again, Calypso's face terrifies me. The music is outstanding and have some rock and orchestrated tunes that I highly recommend you hearing these tunes, especially the rooftops level. And the gameplay is alright, though I usually play with the Deadly Force control instead of the standard control, but nevertheless, it functions well enough. Though disappointed that there's no replay value once you beat it for the first time. Maybe if they could have kept the live action ending cutscenes, then it would have been better to play it again with each driver so they could make it to the end and see their endings, but that never happened. But the multiplayer mode is good and lots of fun, which for me is a highlight for this game. Overall, it's a decent game, but a bit lacking in a few spots that I only recommend it if you're either doing a marathon of the series, or a die-hard collector of the series, or just novelty purposes only. So what happened after that? Well, seemingly, with huge successes, comes in sequels, and there were a lot of them. With the only 4 games that I would tackle in the future is Twisted Metal 2 in 1996, which is the best one of the PS1 lineup, Twisted Metal 3 in 1998, which is the worst one in the PS1 lineup, Twisted Metal 4 in 1999, which people consider it bad, but I kind of like it and consider it to be a guilty pleasure of mine, which I will discuss it in the future. And Twisted Metal Small Brawl in 2001, which is the only spin-off title to the series. After the PS1 days were over, there were 3 more main titles, which are Twisted Metal Black, Twisted Metal Head-On, both handheld and home console, and Twisted Metal 2012, as well as a crossover fighting game called PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, featuring Needles Kane as a playable character, and an upcoming television series which was announced back in March 2019, but heard no further updates after it. Though many believe either it got cancelled or if it's in development hell, but as of 2021, it's unknown if it will ever come out. We'll just have to wait and see. Before I give this game an official rating, I want to mention that the creator of Twisted Metal, David Jaffe, has his own YouTube channel called Obviously David Jaffe, where he talks about games, old and new, and does live stream on his channel every week from Mondays through Fridays at 3 PM Pacific Time. If you're interested in checking out his content, I've sent a link to his YouTube channel down in the description below, as well as a link to a playlist where he was featured and talked about the history of Twisted Metal in a 3-part retrospective series by Ganry Perez, where I got most of the information about the first game. So props to him for getting the creator of Twisted Metal and learning new information about its origins and its development history, and an interview of him as well. Anyways, with everything I said about its history and my thoughts about the game, I give my official rating a 3 out of 6. Next time on the PlayStation years, we go back to Psygnosis and tackle their second game released in the US, with this one being based on the sport of Demolition Derby and the first North American game to use the link cable peripheral. What is that game? Well, I'll tell you in the next review. Thanks for watching.